Welcome to Make Believe Land. This is improvisation, and of course, it has the charm of the flow. And if I decide to write it down, I have to slow down, stop the flow, and then write down B with a half note for the melody, tied, and then B, C sharp, D. Taking it on dictation, but then I am already stopped from my natural flow on the next note. And then you think in the interpretation, oh my God, it's in B minor, it's sort of cradling. The accompaniment has 16th note F sharp, D, F, and then E, F, and then F, F, both sharps, which creates a sense of, you would say, 6, but it's not written as such, just with ostinato F sharp, and then the low bass note a la Chopin, perhaps, not played together with the right hand. And when I play it, I embed immediately an interpretation of this slight delayed dislocation of these four notes B, A sharp, D, C sharp, which I could reduce to a dotted eighth note 16 with a tie to a triplet that would have also a dotted eighth note 16, which would be sort of a rubato, but very overly, most likely, micromanaging the pianist, who eventually would, if not ever, look at this music one day, not knowing what I had in mind. And if I write just the 4/8 notes, it would be perhaps possible to write on top dolce or a piacere, as you like, or dolce. And then, of course, the problem is that the first bar, okay, is gonna be in 4/4, most likely. Could be in 2/4, but it's less bars. And then you see, when you start notating, the problem is that you start thinking, at least I do, too much the details rather than the flow of the structure. At the same time, the macro and the micro. And unlike a piece which already exists in that you play because it's published and people know about it, this one, like all pieces that are made up, make-believe land, as I said in the beginning, okay, you don't know the ending, when or how. It's gonna end somehow, or before you, if you die before it, like Bach did so beautifully, but it's terrible to die. Bach shouldn't have. We miss him. When he was writing the fugue of one of his, Alt Nicole, his son-in-law, was writing it down for him because of his eye operation, which turned so terrible. And he died, so the fugue, in the art of the fugue, finishes in the middle. Here I don't know if it's going to be finished. But what happens is that once I take the time to write it down, then I have, like all of us, when you write a text or a poem or a music or something, I start thinking and hearing more things because I have the leisure to stop. And I don't know if all of them are necessarily wise, because then it becomes predictable. I do this so-called imitation in the tenor. And then you wonder if in the flow of events it should be more simple, and instead of doing the imitation, just do. A chromatic scale, and you feel like all of a sudden, because of that, one thing leading to another, you start thinking, okay, I'm going to write a chromatic scale which can then lead me at its arrival it's B minor anyway, in 2 beats. I have 7/16 notes. You can have a modulation to G. secondary dominance, or just something very more improvised, like layered two-voice invention based on such a beautiful leaps of intervals, which if you harmonize, it's richer, but it's also more stuffy. And if you just have that's very true, that when I compose, I think that I am in fact not imagining something new, because in a way it's not. Sounds like Debussy, perhaps a bit of Brahms for sure, or more Brahms than Debussy, regardless of which point of view you look at it. But that shouldn't be, because it's too unsubtle to say that. And many young people who write self-censor themselves by saying, it's already been done before me. But not really, perhaps in part. But it's you who bring your own alchemy, your own, whatever, it's you. And I still think the tonal system, for whatever old-fashionedness, even if it went through so many models of styles, to allow so many people to express themselves compositionally so differently, allows to say things that are different than the other, while they're reminiscent of something. And so what? There's no spontaneous generation. It comes from something, either subconscious or conscious. The beautiful thing about improvising is that you're not tethered by the note that you have to write down, because it stops you. And you feel like you let go when you improvise, as if you let the leash ride you and the dog pull you, or then you hold the dog down back rather with the leash. So sometimes when you stop and start, as I do, demonstrate here, the danger of notating is that it becomes more and more predictably logical, or perhaps falsely impulsive, because you lose the spontaneity of the word that is not always connected to a meaning, perhaps just for the beauty of it. Of course, if you write atonal, and like a haiku in Japanese, when you could say words that seem not to be connected but poetically, I don't know, sky, bridge, cow, and moon. And then it's kind of scattered genre, or perhaps something minimalist. Which seemingly doesn't evolve, but it does in tiny ways inside itself. And creates a kaleidoscope of sound combinations. But you float somewhere and everywhere at the same time in sort of a zero gravity. And when you do this, you're way more too settled. It is reminiscent of something, but B minor also, but not only. And the parallel six probably make me think of Brahms, but not only. And the coloristic ideas, perhaps. So that is exactly what is the problem when you notate. You start thinking, okay, I cannot leave the second half bare as the first half of the first bar in the second bar. So on the spot is very tempting, because this is developmental thought. This is organizing, filling up things with either secondary voices, either something more rich than the simplicity of the melody and the accompaniment, but which in a way is the charm of what I had in the beginning. And do I really want it overpopulated with ideas that are sophisticating it to the point to which it chokes it? But who decides if it does, since there is no comparison with an existing piece in complexity or in length or in form. When is it redundantly repetitive and when do you need to change? So of course then I can record this improvisation and notate it on dictation and then edit it. It will lose the charm if it's edited of what it was when it was free speech. You have emotion, you say I love you, and you might trip in your word because you're emotioned by the fact that it means so much to you to say to the person I love you. It could be funny as a blooper, or as they call it at the end of the films when you see them. But it's the charm of life, and in a way the inspiration of the intuition, which anyway should be at the heart of things, should be somehow translated in a notation so that there is a flow of events that bring us from point A to point Z at the end, wherever the end is. If even it has to be, because you can very well say, don't need it. Not good. It sounds like everything else. But everything does. So what brings me in this case, I've talked to myself in the third person, I will really sound like totally crazy. I would say, music somehow plays in my head like most of us do when we're in music. I guess you can also have words play in your mind. Colors or combination of shapes and forms, or all kinds of forms of things that you cannot even define. They happen so closely, so fastly, almost like daydreams or like real dreams perhaps. You cannot put a shape to things, and then you try to extract them either from you, I don't know where, but it comes out through a notation, and the notation is a sophisticated knowledge of how to translate what you heard inside yourself. But then because you read it and you look at it, it starts becoming structured. And then because structured, it becomes knowledgeable. And the knowledge, in a way, overwhelms the intuition. So the improvisation is charming because it's improvised. And the notation brings the piece to be much way shorter, because in a way, there's no need for redundancies. You say something, you create an atmosphere, you have an imaginary storytelling if it's in the melody. And then you're done. So either you go to another section or another pattern or another element, or you start developing your thought and saying, I can bring secondary voice, I can have more imitation. Very often when I improvise, I let myself purposely fly away, almost as if I will get dizzy and never back, by improvising, by bifurcating in some modulation. And then find that little chord that's often diminished seven, but not always, which brings me back to B minor. This illusion that you almost lose yourself in the escapism, but then in a way you find a delicious way to return, and you, in that storytelling that is not related to an image, because it's not movie music or film music or game music, it's just by itself talking. And it says something without lyrics, in the mood and the atmosphere. So it has something of a storytelling. And if you go into some distant modulation, the listener hears something coloristically different or atmospherically different, regardless how they feel another tonality, regardless even if you can name it. but they feel that somehow, and then all of a sudden in C major, and you're in E, in B back. I know Schubert has done it a lot, and Chopin too. So why me? Why not? It's always a problem because at some moment you become arrogant when you consider that it's worth enough to be written, developed, organized, and then possibly published. For what? For whom? Is it so important? Am I that important to consider that this is good enough to be, so to say, remaining, whatever that means actually, because it's going to be probably forgotten, like thousands and millions of pages of music, but by essence I could do what I did with the earlier page, just what most artists, I assume, do, the first draft or something. I don't do that often actually, but to demonstrate, I wanted to show you how the thought process, fluidity of the improvisation has a charm that is unbelievably lost when it's written down. And even if you take it on dictation with the flow and you take the time to notate it, and you don't want to overwhelm it with extra elements that come to mind when you start writing or notating that flow, which was beautiful, I think, because it was simple. Or if not simple, and it was not overly sophisticated. But so many thoughts come in mind when you can revisit it. In terms of patterns, extra voicing. I don't speak of interpretation, though. This rhythmicity, I prefer the eighth notes, and then perhaps have the artist who might play it feel if they have to do. For teaching so many music pieces of dead composers to students, I'm the one who try to say yes, a little, but not too much, because then it sounds affected if it's guessable. It has to be on the spur of the moment, if planned, because obviously the piece is already existing for the pieces I teach, from the dead composers to the students, whom I am the hyphen with the composer's DNA of thought process. I'm sure every composer, or if not most, and of course I'm not in their minds, except guessing the dead ones for my students, right? Proceed differently. Perhaps they hear a melody, perhaps they write it on the table, they don't try it on the piano right away, and they just try to write something that they don't play, but they hear in their head, and it can be some kind of a imitational element. It's very difficult to be objective with such a subjective facts, which is the writing, the inner hearing, not even the visualizing on the fingers, and you just write one voice and another voice, and then you find the beauty of the gestural elements for the intervals. And but does it mean that it will sound, literally sound, as your inner imagination idealizes it? In a way, one is always relatively, or has to be, for protecting themselves, for protecting their creativity from overwhelming income. You have to be literally bit deaf in order to block all the music, background or real that comes to you every day, everywhere you are, and let this inner music that plays in you in its creative flows, and sometimes repetitive and all, not be interfering with it. It's not easy, because life is life. You don't just stay somewhere and write something in absolute terms. Of course, when I studied contrapoint fugue and how to organize a certain order of notes that creates a balance of harmony of the movements of the motions, That's contrapoint, well-behaved in society patterns and of voices. I find it very intuitive and at the same time very tempting. And then at some point you start writing it and you try it. So I intertwined the two voices between the two hands, and I heard it so beautifully, like as if it was a flute and oboe or soprano and the alto. I don't know why I'm looking at the score, nothing is written. But I imagine it in a certain way that I bring out this time one of the voices with my voice, even if I'm not a singer, which is self-evident when you hear me. But it helps me for not thinking through my fingers for this verse or this part of this layer. Of course, I don't have many voices to sing at the same time. And I could use it in the MIDI with an electronic keyboard and it will play it back for me, even if I play one line at a time. And then the secondary voice. And then a little sound, and you can assign different coloristic elements synthetically. So in my inner ear, before I tried it on the piano, unlike this, which I wrote just as I started improvising it, which is taking on dictation something spontaneously organized, already done, cooked and served, so to say, and almost consumed. It's exactly logical when you're a pianist. You shape it, you organize it, you hear it. Somehow you don't know if you command it, it commands you. It's probably both. At the same time, you let yourself navigate. If not, you're going to be overly holding back and self-censoring anything before it happens. And if you accept anything that happened ahead in the improvisational style notating it, then it becomes sort of like just a blah 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 of music. So a certain writing calls for a certain logic, therefore editing, organizing, and keeping the essence of the material rather than the flow of the events. And improvising is charming because I think it brings you and the storytelling and the atmosphere and a certain sense of redundancy, which I accept fully, which logical brain would eliminate by saying you don't need to restate it. So you can change harmonies every eighth note, every 2 half beats or half bar. But this section of the sort of 2-voice improvisation, if I didn't write it because I heard it with 2 timbres overlapping, it becomes a single voice of the 2. A combination of the 2, but if I spread it, since on the piano I have such a large range, I could do. But then it's dislocated. Now that becomes intellectual reorganization of the spaces. And there's nothing wrong with the intellectual. I seem to be criticizing the intellectuality. But in fact, you cannot help yourself but think. And when you think, you develop, you organize, you chop, you shape. That's the process. At least that's what you're taught to do. You think, you organize, and when you play in real time, sometimes there are moments or even bars or sometimes sections where you have both the structure and the flow and no redundancy. Wow! That doesn't happen often. It demands concentration and at the same time relaxation. The brain has to be there to guide without to choke the flow, and the flow has to be there creatively going forward without to repeat itself until you think of the next thing to do, because the listener will hear that. Of course, the bar numbers or the bar lines shouldn't be heard by the listener. They are there for rehearsing, learning, or practicing purposes, and also for transmitting purposes. Unless somebody takes on dictation one of my improvisations, then I furnish this, even if there is, for me personally, a difference between the two, as I explained, the written and the improvised, or the improvised becoming sculpted written, where the elements are kept only for the essence and you take away the rest of the material, of the raw material. In this kitchen cooking situation, you can apply all your knowledges about developmental, thematic, material, modulations, harmonization, voice leading, organization of group of bars into this or that secondary tonalities, and then a secondary melodic line, or a theme, or a B section, and then a return with some kind of transition without the transition becoming too calling, phony, obvious. You have to do something subtle innuendo. You're not going to go, this is a transition, and then in something, well, of course I won't do that. But the point is that it's the easy demonstrative contrasting B section. And perhaps it doesn't need a B section. And perhaps this is the B section, which is not so bad, to constantly rethink the status quo and question it and think, perhaps my A section, if there was to be, will be. And the beauty of it is something combined between melody and accompaniment compared to this, which is more settled, and this with the triplets 2 against 3. It's more in emotion and in an intriguing way unsettled. Okay, that's a contrasting with unsettled. But when you think about somebody like Satie, he didn't go for any complexity, sophistication, and God forbids Debussy, Ravel, and many of the others of his time period did. And that's beautiful too, when it's sophisticated beauty. He kept it just like background music, as he called it. Even Debussy, when he orchestrates this one, he adds a triplet in the harp. I wonder how Satie accepted that. Well, anyway, he survived Debussy, and he must have been thankful. Because, I mean, to be orchestrated by Debussy, not bad, huh? The best. Perhaps close to Ravel, in terms of orchestration. But if you add elements, then you don't just orchestrate, in fact, you recompose. Oh, the famous thin line for improvisation, composition, interpretation, and then transcription or restatement, authenticity. At least there is no text for this piece. Teaches me right? Since that's what it is, I have to justify to the student who plays on the text why I might differ with some of the elements of the interpretation indicated there according to the various source materials, even if Chopin composed it 3 times, say copied it at least, to print it by 3 publishers in Germany, France, and England. So we have multiple, in fact, authenticities in Chopin. And sometimes perhaps just in the process of copying, subconsciously or not caring, well, caring, he did care, but perhaps not notice that he did slight differences, and that gives musicologists the specific things that you can read in the last pages with all of the details. So this is the advantage of this piece, is that first of all, it doesn't exist even if it's reminiscent of many, and there is no addition. Now I'm already adding the B with the half diminished seventh, and have delayed C sharp as a second degree in the bass. I don't think it's that bad to compose on the piano. I know that many people consider it less pure music, and I don't disagree. Especially if it's not for piano, but regardless, even if you add for orchestra, opera, or choir, or I don't know, brass or anything, somehow you hear it inside your head, and then it comes out one way or the other. I personally think that if I'm a violist, I might think of it more with the bowing and my primary instrument, or a singer. Caruso writing a voice aria, or Paganini a sonata, or Isai. He wrote very few pieces with piano, more genre pieces or atmosphere pieces, but most of his pieces, which mean his compositional inspiration and know-how, are violinistic, like Paganini. So they couldn't not think through their instrument, or Liszt, Chopin through the piano, and Mendelssohn, and of course Saint-Saëns, and Rachmaninoff and Mettner, but Stravinsky, Bartók, yeah, Bartók perhaps more, but Stravinsky less. I mean, piano as an instrument, but testing the elements, but not per se for the piano, by the piano, through the piano, as a medium between my inner world imagination and the score that will go to the next person who will play it or not. And if they do, they have to come up with how it sounds. So how much pedal do I put? Do I have to indicate? And then if I do that, then I will start thinking, okay, perhaps I should change it with a harmony, which is every half bar. But then it becomes too stuffy. Perhaps I have to change it here on each beat, but I lose the bass. That's without the middle pedal. And even if people have or don't have it, and mostly do today, the middle pedal, it becomes nitpicking. And in the process of this demonstration of the cooking today, welcome to Make Believe Land. I thought about C natural rather than E. See, already changed the harmony 3 times in the second half of the bar 3 while we talking. Well, I talk. Compared to now I have a chromaticism in opposite direction. You see, that's over-sophistication. Why should I accept this new thought that I just had about it? Because the more I replay it, the more I add ideas, and I should be able to know when to not add them. Better is not best. Less is better. But who decides? Where is your text? It's my text. Process of these few minutes together, when I exposed to you a little bit of the kitchen work of the creativity, at least what I experienced, you already heard more than ever you would need to hear many times me repeating the first bars, because in a way I always search for the next bars. And what makes the flow of the next come better? A transition should be seamless. I think so, because nothing is worse than a transition that calls itself so. Because then you get distracted by the purity of the melodic line and the phrasing with the harmonization. You want to float in some kind of, you don't want to see it has to be seamless. and somehow transitions are very obvious, seems. But nothing wrong with it, actually, but that's not my... I try to avoid that. I want everything to appear just when it's supposed to blossom out of something, and all of a sudden you're somewhere else. Hello, Berg. The sonata for those who know it. And now something for age. With an harmonic return. That's very pianistic. It's almost like a vocalist. Oh, oh, oh. But if I sing one voice, do, re, fa, mi, re, do, si, sa, sol, fa, and if I had lyrics to put or a poem to set in music, I'll try to find a flow of syllables in a way that it doesn't imitate the meaning of the words, but it hints perhaps even contradictory. If it speaks of peacefulness and you have the music with 2 against 2 rhythmically, it shows some kind of inner turmoil. But if you follow and you sound paint the text and then you make it sung and played, which is what a lieder could be, and melody in the French genre, as soon as you put lyrics, I think all of these harmonic melodic organizations fade away because the meaning prevails on the mood. And that's why the language is there for the meaning, as I'm just conveying to you some of my abstract thoughts. I don't need to explain them. I just play my improvisation and it talks for me. Regardless how we understand each other. But if I have to say, I love you so, so much or more, I have to find some kind of flow of the drop without to be guessable, because I love you much, so much of flow, it becomes guessable. And it's not bad to be guessable, because it is part of the storytelling too. Sometimes you have redundancies in the poems too, of course, not most of the time. But sometimes you have just surprise words. What does it mean? In what way did the composer, the poet, think of this as a sound, as a music of the word itself? It doesn't need music to have music express the music of the word, which expresses a thought, which is hinted. Oh. Can't even find enough words in my sentence to explain all that. The 2 against 3 is a very tempting improvisational tactics, because it allows for something that flows with certain less rigidity. Because of the 2 against 3, where 1 out of 2 match together. Compared to where every 2 you play together. 16th notes, 8th notes, 8th note of triplets in 8th notes of 8th notes by 2. In the brain flashlight and bring you here and there, and they mirror your playing, and you think ahead of the same time than you play. It's almost an exchange with yourself. In fact, it's a dialogue with yourself, but not in a narcissistic way. It's more about the music itself becoming the element, unless it's written, in which case you play the score. Here you play your thoughts of sort of a memorized ahead music. It's kind of awkward concept to say, but you yearn to go towards somewhere, having started somewhere, and in between you don't know how long it will take and what will happen, through where you'll pass. And philosophers like to say truly that it's in the journey that is the point of the trip, not only in the arrival, but somehow both, since you have to play the piece that you know ends the way it does, as if you don't. That's what theater actors do every day when they replay a scene where they have to be surprised or die, or they have to be believable. Create a rupture of disbelief in the listener, who doesn't see them acting anymore, because unless they're bad. And you don't hear the bar lines when you play, because that would be bad too. But they're there. So there is a structure that has to be seamless, and there is an acting that has to be seamless, so that you believe in the character rather than the actor playing the character. And you believe here in the text that is in music hinting something. And even if there are real words, lyrics, they shouldn't diminish too much the emotional content that is supporting them, because in a way either overwhelms it, either then it just tone painting that is very obvious because of the meaning of the words and the meaning of the sentence. And then you install, in fact, harmonically a mood, and melodically a thematic material that can interact with the voice. If you do, I would like to tell how much and the voice doesn't have a decay unless it breathes, but the piano does. And so they can be shorter notes. I cannot sing a high D anymore. It's not in head voice. I'm sorry if I'm solfeging, because I know that not everybody does. But that's the way I was taught. And I mean it quite thankfully so, because I find that through life of a musician, for the decades that I have passed through now, solfeging is putting music in the mouth. It's almost chewing it, singing it, other than only playing it, since I can only play it on the piano. But if I sing some of it and I put the solfege notes, like I could do la la la. I could go blah blah blue, anything. Just calling the names of the notes. It's practical, because in the Latin or Italian denomination you have a good combination of vowels and consonants, so you don't have to go too much wow wow wow, because you have always a beginning with a consonant most of the time, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, si, all of them, and then some end with a vowel, most of them, o, e, I, but so it's easy to go do, re, mi, fa, do, re, mi, fa, sol. You could see C, D, C, D, E, C, D, F, C, D, F, G. But there are too many vowels to me. I mean, I'm not used to it, that's why. So when I vocalize or immerse myself musically in a piece, regardless if it's mine or not, I often sing. The point of it is what? To have another access to the element than through the finger memory. Does it mean that all music is transformable to all genres? A ballet becoming an opera, a quartet becoming a sonata, or rather a sonata becoming a, I don't know, a motet, or perhaps an oratorio? Possibly. Busoni did transform the chaconne for solo violin to an inspirational, sounds to me like an organ piano transcription. This kind of things happen. Proteoformic music. I think that we can hear it differently because we know other pieces written by the composer. We know operas of a given composer. We play the piano piece of, if there is, or symphonies, or quartets, or trios, or I don't know, film music even. And regardless which genre, the fact is that you bathe in that musical universe of this composer who inevitably cherishes more this or that. When I said earlier about reminiscent of Brahms with the six, is because the D minor concerto has six. So does it mean every time you do parallel six you do Brahms? No, that would be too unsubtle, and it is unsubtle to say. But it's reminiscent. And if I was to do, let's say, chords like especially parallel augmented fifths, everybody will go Debussy, Debussy, Debussy. So what? If people say, or yourself says to yourself, this is too much reminiscent of this or that, it's giving yourself a consistent and constant self, as I call it, censorship. On behalf of what? And I think that should be just like the dictatorship of the wrong note for piano playing. I think the dictatorship of the self censorship in composition should be banned. You have plenty time to not keep it or reject it if you don't think it's necessary. But who knows, in the eyes of the beholder or the ears and the fingers of somebody else, they might regret that you didn't leave it. They might find meaning to their lives through it, or not. I mean, I find through Bach's music a lot of soulful connection that means to me, and I cannot think without these pieces. But so does millions of people playing the piano. So this is the universal Bible. But let's say that this is not that, and will never be that for sure. But in the essence of its making, for its destination, and how I project people will or not, but if they do, absorb it, receive it, organize it, and state it. Their way, not mine. Do I give them the right to write the next half of the page, let's say? That was done in the 70s with aleatoric music. I personally don't do that. Yet. If ever. I try to bring something completed that sounds inspiringly spontaneous. So that spontaneous does not really contradict the thoughtful process. Thoughtless with thoughtful. Versus or with the right balance. And they find the decisive element is not you even. Generally, my experience is that if a piece is too long, people don't play it. If it's long but interesting, regardless if it's developmental, if it's atonal, or if it's for whichever reason, their attention is called for and renewed. And of course, there's a lot of reflection in listening to classical compared to pop music, because one is there to vehicle some reaction to the beat, to the harmony, or if not to the chord, whatever notes they have, of course the lyrics, and that's always necessary. And classical music is often more intellectualized. Oh, you have to think, or it brings you as a listener to enter in your thoughts. You start moving in your daydreams, make-believe lands. That's what I said in the beginning. I think it is. The ultimate escapism from yourself into yourself, the yourself of the imagination, from the yourself of the writing or the yourself of the playing, and then the yourself played by somebody else. And that is so touching to transmit innerly only through the signs of the page. All and more of all life in each note, in terms of sincerity of the text, earnestness of the inspiration, and not only know-how that can become overwhelming compared to the inspiration. Because even if you have a great know-how to how to organize the notes, if originally the melodic or thematic material is not an unforgettable perfume, forget it. It will be another well-written music. But does it touch you? Does it connect you? Do you not forget it ever? At least seemingly. Can I insert now my two-voice interval sort of invention with the highest register holding the bass with a harmony. So now I insert it either as a transition to something else, either as a developmental theme of the original, but then at some point I have to decide where do I end this opening, which becomes obsessive now that I played it so many times and you heard it so many times, you know how obsessive it becomes. You cannot get it out of your head. You shouldn't forget it, but you shouldn't, you should let it rest. And then you go back to it. The problem is when you get back to it tomorrow, tonight, after the next week, whenever you have time, or you think you have an inspiration for it, or you work on the inspiration by the thought process, so you don't have to just, you sort of bring the inspiration by the know-how, and then you erase the know-how to allow the inspiration to blossom. You don't want to harness it. But then you'll be never writing what you would have written now. It will go with a continuation of these bars that will go in a direction that will never go now, improvised or written. It will be another patchwork of completed piece by here and there when you write it. Because in between now and the next time I'll look at it or work on it, I would have taught in somebody some piece, or I would have gone to do something to bring something, etc. Live. Called, spoken with somebody, exchanged, seen, read. So I will be not the same as the one I was here now. And I have to accept that, unless I just compose in continuous and do nothing else. And if you never compose, or try to start, or try to notate, and work with this what I think is very ambiguous duality of the inspired and the organized, the improvisational and the structured, then you'll never start it. Because you'll say, it's a good idea, but I really don't know how to even, where to start from. And I've heard so many people say that. And I think notate your thoughts, even if they are imperfect and very few, at least they stay there and you can go back to them visually after you imagine them from your inner ear, and then see later how it's going to develop into something else, or the flow of what you thought finally this should have been. And who defines it if you did or not take the right path, since there are no paths ahead of you, since the piece doesn't exist? It's a kind of intuitive knowledge that you're in the right path, and if you feel like it was a tempting path but that it brought you to a dead end, one way or the other, you have to go back, trace your steps until where the fork of the option is to go this way or that way, formally or just harmonically or melodically. And you know, it's interesting because when I teach written music by others, and I play it myself, of course, I'm a pianist, I think often of the piece, not as if I make it up because I'll be in a delirium to think so, but or in denial of reality. But I like to let myself guided by the beauties of the piece that reveals themselves differently, perhaps of an acoustical point of view, or my rhythmic or way I've displaced the 2 against 2 rhythmically, or I made a mistake and I hit another key, and all of a sudden it opens and all other world could be unlocked of a modulation that was unpreset, but was not there. But it keeps you alive. Vibrating membrane of the piece that you know, that you don't feel like you're just repeating it and repeating it. I'm gonna play again the same piece that I know forever. If that is the case, and it always goes out through the same way, through from the beginning to the end, I think nobody will do that. It'll be boring to them, literally boring. Not boring because of blasé or some kind of attitude. No, I speak about the intellectual awakeness, the freshness, the yearning for the pure, for the flame, like Scriabin said, vers la flamme, towards the flame. You go towards something, even if you know it's written. Of course, I don't know that this, and then I don't have the right to do that. He already closed the shop. And if I don't like it, don't understand it, don't translate it, don't mean it, don't believe in it, don't sound believable, just reciting the notes, I'm boring in the sense that I am not involved, I'm not immersed, I'm not compelling the listener to be with me. Because every arrival point should have another drive, step, semi-step, regardless. And I want to bring them to the dominant fiercely. Of course, they know the piece if they do, and if they don't, they since, have they heard other Beethoven sonatas, they start guessing. Because it's a genre of a style which is in the 19th century early. Okay, fine, perfect. So we are among people who know the book, and I am reciting the book, and they're listening to the book. But most of the time they don't need anybody to read them the book. I mean, unless you have an audio book. Because somehow the book is an intimate dialogue between the author and your psyche and your mind, and the author's storytelling. And the more you read beautiful or interesting or compelling books of a given author, the more you know about the given author's preferred length of sentences or change of pace in this or that, or usage of specific word. And it's like entering back in an atmosphere that you enjoyed, that was enticing. It's like going to a country where it was interesting to be. And you want to know. You want to be. You want to immerse. And I like to do that believably with pieces that are written for my students or myself as a performer. I don't want to appear like I'm faking the surprise. Oh my God! This minor major conclusion to the first exposition. Compared to 505, 1 in A flat major, relative major. Okay, but with a diminished 7, I could be in minor, which is not the relative major, Picardy third arrival. And I have a syncopation of the beat. So was that spontaneous, or did he do? I think he decided, now I'm going to harmonize it with chordal, but of the beat. So minor, major, no downbeat, no beat. Regardless how he got to it, right away or through other paths in his compositional DNA, I know it because you know it when you know the piece as listener, and I know it as a performer. And if you don't know it as a listener, I bring you the offbeatness of the left hand or the right hand dotted rhythm that is very assertive in minor, in major. But in the case of the first Beethoven sonata from 1800 or 1790 something, this, now you know because you've heard it for the last many minutes that we're being together now. Therefore, what brings you to be humble, knowledgeable, therefore, by knowing many other pieces of many other composers, still manage not to self-censor and say, it's not worth anything, reminiscent of others, because everything is reminiscent of somebody, Beethoven, of Haydn in the early period, etc. But because it's Beethoven, and I'll be only one of them, nobody likes to think that he was influenced, because in a way it's either obvious, either not really explanatory, because in a way we like him also because of his oeuvre, especially the late works. And how would have we appreciated Beethoven as a concept of a composer who did what he did to the world's meaning of music if he had only written the Für Elise? It's not exactly representative of the Beethoven's Fifth Symphony or Ninth Symphony, but it's all of it that is part of Beethoven. And while some composers like Duparc threw away all of their compositions before they died, as if to say, an ultimate gesture of humility, thankfully 15 songs were left at the publisher, and we have them. They're so inspired. I love so much Duparc's French art songs, and I think how lucky that they were not all, perhaps all of them were not like these ones that were put in the Seine River by him, but, and who is he to decide for us, to deprive us from it? I used to teach the Tieus Sonata, and when he was alive, and he was one of my teachers, and I would call him and tell him that I'm teaching his piece, asking some questions about choices of this and that in his writing, and he would consistently say, don't teach my sonata, I don't like it. But it's published, of course, everybody plays it now. Since 1944 he composed it, but he still was telling me on the phone as an old man, don't teach my sonata. I should have written something else, he says, besides his etudes or preludes. So composers have mixed feelings about their music. Perhaps like parents, children, relatives. It could be a good analogy, I'm not sure. Perhaps recordings for artists who don't compose. It's a bit of their composition that is the, in fact, coating of the composition to their interpretation that persistently will stay. If I notate it and I write the first 2 beats and then nothing for the next 2 beats and then the downbeat of the next bar and again nothing and then nothing, and that would be interesting, because then the second half of each of these consequence of the dotted half of the melody, somebody could come, or perhaps or who knows what. And if you give that group of bars, beats, or sections with freedom and say, compose your cadenza there, collaborate with my piece, become part co-composer, for the music of the past is forget it. In the time of the music of the past, when it was taught and played like in Bach's time, he was expecting the students to not play his invention, but as a template do their own, even if the patterns are barely changed. But still, today is play exactly what's written. Don't imagine something that could be alike. And that teaching by niche of knowledge or skills, both, allows you to be creative, but within all the constraints of the written text. But before it's written, I have still, as long as I breathe, I'm technically up the, I like to say, the craftsmanship shop is open. And if a performer tells me, you know, I'd rather do this or that, I might say, rightfully, yeah, you think I should have thought of it. Not that I don't have a conviction about exactly what I want, because that would be very autocratic. And it is in a way, by choosing to write this and that and this pitch and this rhythm, is that I exclude all the others. So by excluding, you choose, and by choosing, you present, and by presenting, you shape, and by the shape, you prove, or you bring a point, basically, regardless if it's a point or just an atmosphere. And so if a composer, as a student or performer, plays for me a piece of mine that they heard another note and mistakenly misguessed it, perhaps, as in their own intuition, it should have been this or that, I think, wow, that was not in my intuition, but it's in theirs. What if they do this? I don't think it's terrible. Actually, it's a good alternative. Sorry, I continue writing it in my mind while I talk to you. I've noticed as a piano teacher that if I ask a student to play differently a certain section because I ask it, being the teacher of the piano for the piece that is already existing, either they trust me during the lesson and they accept, or perhaps disagree after, but I tell them, do this tempo, do this articulation, this pedal, and they try it at least. And if they're convinced, they might use it, and if they're not convinced, they might not say it if they're polite, but there is an exchange of real-time changes happening on the spot in the interpretation level. But if you tell a composer student who brings you a piece like this, and you tell him or her, you know, you should think of this differently and find something rising rather than dropping, most likely the composer student will say, no, that's how I wanted it. But if you tell a student, don't play that so dry, play it, they go, oh, okay, that's another way. And perhaps they'll say, I hate it. Who does he think he is to ask me that? Because musically it means to me different. Oh, my publisher doesn't say that. Oh, my other recording that I like of somebody playing it doesn't say that. But at least there is a sense of factual things you can try. Fingerings, phrasings, organization of the patterns. But when it's written, my favorite thing when I compose is when I'm trying the piece like that, as I just did. I read it and play it, hear it and connect, and try to evaluate it immediately, what I should do or not, keep or not, change or not, and organize or not differently. But then I hit a mistake note, just like it became a mistake when you play a piece that's written, and you go like, oh, let me seize that mistake and develop that path that could have brought me something. It's like a bright eye in the eyes, the flames. And then you go after, you think? It's too predictable. Yeah, they taught me counterpoint, I have to do opposite directions. But is it so bad to be parallel? Sometimes parallel is beautiful. Sometimes contrary emotion is meaningful or beautiful too. Does everything have to be defined by logic? Does everything have to be backed up by an opinion? Can the teacher change something without the student of composition say, no way, it's this way or nothing? As if a piano student says, no, I'm going to not try your phrasing or your fingering. Perhaps because they don't feel so connected to the piece. Here the composer student feels it's like their identity is there. Of course, it could be only an assignment. It doesn't have to be the piece of their life. But nevertheless, there is a sort of intellectual property action here. And even if the composer student is supposed to be, the composer teacher is supposed to guide the composer student perhaps for the next piece to change something that they don't want to change on this, that is sort of a way of thinking the flow, or avoiding the ostinato, or changing the pattern of the rhythms more often, not allowing it to settle down in a predictable way. Not concepts, not practical changes on the very note that you wrote, and they go like, nah, and you go, no, don't touch it. I find that the appropriation of the composer student with their piece is that in order for them to bring it to you as their teacher, they've already macerated, matured, immersed in it, and they have a, if not explainable reason to keep it, at least an emotional or intellectual impossibility to not to change it, or then it doesn't mean to them anyway. Just almost scary, because if it is, then what's the point? It has to mean, every note has to mean, la note juste, as Mademoiselle Boulanger used to say. But that detailed choice of the note juste, the right note, more than the beautiful or the right in terms of wrong, the note that comes in at the right moment for the whole soundscape to be what it is. It just settles in naturally. It becomes an evidence, as if it always existed before, when in fact it didn't before the moment you write it. And sometimes you're so convinced by the placement structurally of that very note that you cannot accept a change, because then it changes the structure of everything, even if it's detailed. If the teacher says, go up, you can objectively say, beautiful, why not? But if the student says, no, I need the melody to drop, you can't change that. So you say, okay, perhaps you should think about the next piece not to write 8 bars in a row that sounds like the first. Perhaps you should evolve right away to something else. And of course, if it's atonal, it'll be easier done. Here, because it's tonal and melodic, moody and atmospheric, therefore, redundancy. In fact, it smells like an improvised notation, because it is. And by the time you erase most of the things and you just keep the melodies in 2 voices, you apply some knowledge of writing 2 voices imitations, extracting from the harmonic, the rhythmic, so at which point does the composer decide, okay, that's it, I keep that, that's solid, that's right, that's what I wanted, that's how I heard it inside me, now it's crystallized, and crystal clear, in a way fossilized, so to say, on the score. Strange choice of analogy again, but I always surprise my own self with the analogies I come up with. And then there are those more flexibly moving elements, which could be going somewhere else. So you have to define what is solid for what you want to keep in these few bars from what you're going into. And as I said earlier, when you go back to it later, you might see way better, because all of a sudden you have the distance with it that you don't have now, because now you're plunged into it. And so you go back to it tomorrow, tonight, later, I don't know, whenever. And you say, oh, of course, that should go there. And then it goes there until, I don't know, bar 72 or 139. And then perhaps the day after that, you just erase everything and say, it's not worth it, except perhaps I can keep this and that and see what I can do with it. But all this doesn't happen in improvisation. In improvisation, you just let your thoughts beautifully in a way, very healthily take a walk and bring you on. You become the dog of the leash, and you let yourself. It's very liberating. Let go. There's no more danger of wrong note or wrong structure. Or not. Thank you for the journey shared.